Welcome, class, to Chapter 8, Crisis of Lethality. This week we talk about suicide, and it is a scary topic usually for students, but I think you'll feel better after we go through the lesson and you get more information. In the book, it talks about Edwin Schneidman as the founder of suicidology. He really looks at suicide as kind of a conscious act of self-annihilation, and it's really looked at as somebody who is in unendurable psychological pain. As a social worker, working with suicidal or homicidal clients is always a possibility. Sometimes an individual in crisis can be homicidal and target a specific victim or random victims, and these homicides are not about the criminal who murders a shopkeeper in a holdup or a wife who kills her husband for insurance. Those are instrumental acts of homicide that occur for some financial gain. Suicide, a suicidal or homicidal person is engaged in an expressive act designed to reduce psychological pain. Such suicidal or homicidal people are likely to be emotionally distraught, may feel gravely wronged, depressed, helpless, disempowered, and hopeless, and they may attempt to solve their own dilemmas through harm to others and then to themselves. I think these statistics really speak for themselves. One person every 40 seconds around the world commits suicide. These rates have risen, and in the United States, there's about 85 people a day that kill themselves. I'm not going to read to you, but I think the thing that I would point out is that, young people have the highest increase during the past 30 years. It's the second leading cause of death among adolescents 15 to 24. Caucasian men over 35 have the highest rate, but 25% of all suicides actually occur in people over 65 years of age. So even if you're working with the older population, you really need to be asking the person about their intent to harm themselves or others. Suicide has a lot of moral implications. It's seen as self-murder. There's stigma attached. It's seen as a tragedy. Accidental death is kind of something that is easy to do, stupid or careless, but death by natural causes or resistance to the end allows grieving without animosity. Less forgivable is natural death by neglect or overindulgence, but the least forgivable death is suicide, for which there is little sympathy and no absolution. Your book talks about starting on page 211 and going through page 214, all the different psychological theories, and that there are many of them. So I'm going to have you read through those just for time's sake on this video. But some of the ones that are kind of more prevalently looked at are the three on this slide. Additionally, suicide is seen as a flight from a situation deemed as intolerable. I've often heard it said that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But the person who is suicidal feels hopeless, feels like there's no way that they can get out of the situation that they're in. And then Durkheim's sociological theory of social integration in 1897. It's one of the most important sociological theories on suicide, and it looks at 4 different types of suicide. I'm going to have you go through those in your book so that, again, I don't take up too much time in this video. They are on page 212. I think this theory is very interesting, the interpersonal theory. Again, it's on page 212. I would encourage you to read about it. But basically, this theory proposes that those with past suicide attempts will be habituated to pain more than other people because of their past attempts. And it also talks about how people whose jobs entail exposure to the pain of others will have higher suicide rates than other people. And research tends to support both of those things. But those 3 central components are very important to understand. How capable is the person of committing suicide? How much do they see a burden of themselves against other people and their family or in society? And how have they failed at belonging? This theory proposes that while many people consider committing suicide, large numbers develop the capability Few actually do it because all three ingredients must be present at once to create the critical mass necessary for the act to occur. So some of the 10 most common characteristics grouped under 6 different aspects are situational characteristics, unendurable psychological pain, common stressor in suicide is frustrated psychological needs, motivational characteristics, um, the common purpose of suicide is to seek a solution. The common goal of suicide is the cessation of consciousness. Affective characteristics, the common emotions in suicide are hopelessness and helplessness. Cognitive characteristics, cognitive state in suicide is ambivalence between doing it and wanting to be rescued. The common perception is of constriction, such that one's options become very narrow and the world is seen through tunnel vision so that no alternative thoughts can emerge. They don't see any other way out. Relational characteristics, the common interpersonal act in suicide is communication of intent, letting another person know that their decision makes sense. And the common action in suicide is egression, or the right to exit or go out as one wishes, or the right to autonomously find a way out of one's pain. And then lastly, serial characteristics. The common consistency in suicide is with lifelong coping patterns when deep perturbation, distress, threat, or psychological pain are present. I'd say these are the most important thing that students kind of come into this class believing. The first one is discussing suicide will cause the client to move toward doing it. Generally, the opposite is true. Discussing it with an empathic person is more likely to provide the clients with a sense of relief and a desire to buy time until they can regain control. Clients who threaten suicide do not do it is a myth. A large percentage of people who kill themselves have previously threatened it or disclosed their intent to others. Suicide is an irrational act. That's a myth. Nearly all suicides or suicide attempts make perfect sense when viewed from the perspective of the person doing it. And people who commit suicide are insane. That's not true. There's evidence of a high degree of association between mental illness and suicide, particularly in chronic depression, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive, borderline schizoid, panic, antisocial personality disorder, and panic disorders, and co-occurring substance abuse. But most suicidal people appear to be normal, who are acutely depressed, lonely, hopeless, or helpless. Suicide runs in families. It is an inherited tendency. This may or may not be a myth. Sometimes more than one family member in a family does commit suicide. Blood type actually has been found to be associated with suicide. Blood metabolites also appear to play a part in suicide. There's now a great deal of evidence that 5-HIAA, the main serotonin metabolite, is low in people who attempt suicide. Once suicidal, always suicidal. Many people contemplate suicide at some time during their lives, but most of them recover from the immediate threat and learn appropriate responses and controls. When a person has attempted suicide and pulls out of it, the danger is over. Actually, most suicides occur within 3 months following the beginning of improvement. One danger signal of the period is a period of euphoria following a depressed or suicidal episode, which often means the person has everything settled and planned and is at peace with the idea of committing suicide. About 10% of those who have previously attempted suicide will go on to kill themselves. And then a suicidal person who begins to show generosity and share personal possessions is showing signs of renewal and recovery. Many suicidal people begin to dispose of their most prized possessions once they experience enough upswing and energy to make a plan. Suicide is always an impulsive act. That was one that got cut off on that last slide. Most suicides are deliberately planned and carried out, so it's not always a myth. Suicide strikes only the rich. Suicide is democratic and strikes all levels of society. Poor people are actually generally a greater risk. Suicide happens without warning. That's a myth. People invariably give many signs and symptoms to their intentions. Suicide is a painless way to die. It often is not, and many suicide attempts that go awry bring terrible suffering and chronic pain and permanent disfigurement. Few professional people kill themselves. Actually, physicians, pharmacists, lawyers, and dentists have the high rate of suicide. But most suicides are deliberately planned and carried out, so it's not always a myth. Suicide is always an impulsive act. That was one that got cut off on that last slide. Christmas season is lethal. Actually, December has the lowest suicide rate of any month. Women don't use guns to try to kill themselves. Women use guns more often than drugs to kill themselves. More suicide occurs during a full moon. There is no increased number of suicides during a full moon. Suicidal people rarely seek medical attention. Research shows that about 75% of people who kill themselves visit a doctor within a month that they kill themselves. Most elderly people who commit suicide are terminally ill. They may be depressed, but they're not terminally ill. Suicide is limited to the young. The suicide rate rises with age and reach their highest level among white males in their 70s and 80s. Suicide thoughts are relatively rare. Each year in the United States, approximately 8.3 million, or 4% of the population, consider suicide. About 1% make a plan, and half of those carry it out. Is path warm? That is a really great acronym for you to remember, and these go through the warning signs of and the risk factors for people who are suicidal. You'll find more of that on page 218 in your book, and it looks at the clinical interview on page 219. In the clinical interview, we should never avoid asking, are you thinking about killing yourself or killing somebody else? How, when, where? We cannot sugarcoat questions about lethality. You have to just ask the question directly. Questions like, have you ever considered hurting yourself, or do you have thoughts about giving up, or have you ever felt overwhelmed? Along with qualifiers like sort of or kind of, are not the same as straight questions about killing yourself, and they wholly imply different interpretations. So asking the question about killing oneself does not mean to do it in an abrasive or callous manner. So really using some of the chronological assessment of suicide events are really important. And so reading through the chapter is going to be really important for you. These are really good, these don'ts. On page 235 and 236, there's actually 24 of them. So I'm not going to read all through this, but do read through all of those because you will find them to be extremely helpful. It's just really important that we don't let our own personal fear interfere in our ability to do good work. So really, don't be afraid to get in and build relationship. We're really going to try to obtain a commitment for somebody to not hurt themselves and have them agree to the plan. It's really important for us to figure out what caused them to become suicidal. What is the precipitating event? Identifying the reason the client got there into that situation is really an important piece. So we really do want to try to obtain some sort of positive commitment and help the person out of the immediate crisis. So read through those 2 pages. I think the most important thing is losing a client. And if you're a social worker and you lose a client to social work or to suicide, it's really important to remember that if people really intend to kill themselves, despite our best efforts to intervene, they can manage to accomplish that task. So you want to take as many steps as possible to try to help your clients, but you really, if something like this ever happens, you'll have to debrief with experts. Supervision is mandatory. If you have a client who's suicidal, you should always seek supervision and help to try to help them and try to get them help. And then there's something called vicarious traumatization. Just by being involved in a traumatic experience, you can be traumatized. The impact of having failed to save a person who's a client or a victim of a client can be overwhelming. And so there's a chapter 16. We'll talk about that even more.